Ma'am, stop right there. We need your identification.
On what grounds?
Immigration check. Show proof of citizenship.
I'm not required to without probable cause.
The parking lot stretched wide and flat under the Texas sun. Lowe's Home Improvement, San Antonio, 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon when the air shimmered and stuck to skin. The temperature gauge on the bank across the street read 102 degrees. Heat rising in waves from black asphalt. Shadows short and sharp beneath a sky bleached white with light. Charlene Green had just finished loading lumber into the bed of her pickup. Wood for a backyard deck she'd been planning for months. 29 years old, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans worn soft from use, work boots dusty from the lumber yard. Nothing about her appearance announced veteran except perhaps the way she moved, economy of motion, situational awareness bred from years spent watching for threats in places where inattention meant death. She reached for the driver's door handle. Heard boots on pavement behind her. Measured steps. Purposeful. 3 federal agents in tactical vests. Ice badges catching sunlight. Moving in formation. They were part of a joint task force with local law enforcement, operating under intelligence bulletins about suspected document fraud networks allegedly circulating through commercial areas in the city. Whether the intelligence held weight or simply provided administrative cover for broad enforcement sweeps would later become central to litigation. The briefing had directed them toward targeted inquiries at locations flagged for irregular employment documentation. What constituted targeting remained deliberately vague. The parking lot security camera mounted on a light pole near the garden center entrance recorded everything. Afternoon sun so bright the footage would show crisp shadows and flawless visibility. Time stamp, 14 hours 15 minutes and 37 seconds. Digital clarity that would later prove invaluable. Agent Brooks led the approach. Broad shoulders, jaw set, moving like a man accustomed to compliance. Agents Ellis and Lee flanked him left and right. Classic containment formation. All 3 wore body cameras already recording. All 3 assumed routine. Stop demand process done. Paperwork filed by evening. They had no idea they were approaching a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. 2 tours in Iraq. Bronze Star for Valor earned during an ambush when she called in air support while pinned under direct fire, saving 3 soldiers who would have bled out otherwise. Training in documentation protocols, interrogation techniques, strategic assessment under pressure. Years spent in hostile environments where reading a situation wrong meant not coming home. They had no idea she'd been trained to stay 3 steps ahead of everyone in any room. Or in this case, any parking lot. Before we continue, if you believe federal agents should need actual evidence before detaining American citizens, hit that subscribe button right now. This story needs to be heard, and your support helps us expose what happens when power goes unchecked. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let us know if you've seen this kind of injustice before. Every share helps spread the truth. Agent Brooks stopped 6 feet from Charlene's truck. The security camera captured his hand resting near his belt. Near his weapon. Body language establishing dominance before words were spoken. Brooks announced himself as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, demanding identification and proof of citizenship. Charlene turned slowly, deliberately, hands visible at her sides. Posture relaxed but balanced, weight evenly distributed. The camera recorded her face, calm, assessing, no fear registering in her expression. She questioned the grounds for the stop. Her voice carried clearly across the parking lot. Steady. Almost conversational. The tone of someone asking a reasonable question rather than challenging authority. Brooks stepped closer. Ellis moved to her right. Lee took position on her left, boxing her in. The camera captured all 4 figures now, the containment formation complete, distances shrinking. Brooks explained they were conducting a joint task force operation, citing intelligence reports of document fraud in the commercial area and their need to verify immigration status. Charlene's eyes moved between the 3 agents. She repeated his words, document fraud, then questioned what specific information connected her to document fraud, what description they were working from. Brooks's jaw tightened. The camera recorded the muscle flex, the subtle tell of a man unused to being questioned. She pressed further, suggesting that if they were stopping her based solely on her appearance in this parking lot, that wasn't an intelligence-driven operation but racial profiling. She pointed out they had seen a black woman loading lumber and decided to demand papers, asking if she was wrong in that assessment. Lee shifted his weight. Uncomfortable. The body camera footage would later show his eyes darting toward Brooks, waiting for direction. Ellis remained still but his shoulders had tensed. Brooks insisted that if her status was legal, the process would take only 5 minutes, telling her to show documentation. Charlene stated clearly that she didn't have to show him anything without probable cause. Her voice projected now, clear enough for the security camera's audio sensors to capture every syllable. She invoked Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable seizure, pointing out that their stopping her without articulable suspicion was unreasonable and unconstitutional. She made clear she wasn't complying just because they had badges. The camera captured Brooks stepping closer, invading her personal space. The distance between them now less than 2 feet. His face reddening in the harsh sunlight. Brooks declared that her refusal to cooperate created suspicion, demanding ID immediately or stating she would be coming with them. Here Charlene's intelligence training engaged. Not the combat reflexes, those hummed beneath the surface, ready but restrained. The strategic thinking. The understanding that in any confrontation, whoever controls the documentation controls the outcome. Whoever establishes the narrative first owns the story. She pulled her phone from her pocket. Movements slow, deliberate, ensuring the gesture registered on camera. Nothing sudden. Nothing that could later be characterized as threatening or evasive. She announced that she was recording the interaction. She held the phone up. Screen visible. Recording indicator clear. A woman walking toward the store entrance stopped. Turned. A man loading groceries into his car 2 spaces over paused, bags forgotten. The camera captured them both. Witnesses materializing. Audience forming. Charlene invoked her Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizure. She also informed the agents that she was a United States Army veteran, honorably discharged with 2 tours in Iraq. She pointed out that her truck had veteran plates, visible behind her. She stated that they had no probable cause for this stop, and she wasn't consenting to any search or seizure. Then she did something the agents hadn't anticipated. She tapped a program number. Speed dial. Set up months ago after watching IC agents harass her elderly neighbor, a naturalized citizen for 30 years but vulnerable enough in appearance to attract attention. Charlene had learned in the military, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Always have contingency plans. The dial tone lasted 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, professional and sharp, cut through the afternoon heat. Elena Ramirez from the Texas Civil Rights Project answered, asking who she was speaking with. The security camera captured Brooks's expression shift. The look of a man realizing his routine stop had just become complicated. Alice glanced at Lee. Both agents visibly thrown, body language broadcasting uncertainty. The camera recorded their weight shifting, the exchanged looks, the sudden lack of coordination in their formation. Brooks started to protest that she couldn't do this. Charlene interrupted, calm but final, stating that she absolutely could. She explained that she was being detained without probable cause by federal agents who'd refused to articulate specific suspicion of criminal activity. She addressed Ramirez directly, informing her that she'd invoked her Fourth Amendment rights and that the agents were continuing to detain her without justification. Ramirez identified herself as an officer of the court and stated she was recording the call. The attorney's voice came through the speaker, clear enough for the security camera to capture. She demanded to know their probable cause for the stop, asking them to be specific about what crime they were investigating. Silence filled the parking lot. The camera recorded all 4 figures frozen in the blazing sun. Charlene with her phone extended, the 3 agents in their semicircle formation. Seconds accumulated on the timestamp. 14 hours 18 minutes and 45 seconds. 14 hours 18 minutes and 46 seconds. 14 hours 18 minutes and 47 seconds. Each second documented. Brooks finally responded, voice tight, stating they were conducting a targeted inquiry as part of Joint Task Force operations regarding document fraud. Ramirez pressed, demanding to know what specific articulable facts connected her client to document fraud. She asked what description they were given, what evidence connected Charlene to criminal activity, and what made this stop targeted rather than random demands for papers based on appearance. More silence. The parking lot continued functioning around the frozen confrontation. Cars pulling in and out. Shoppers navigating with carts. Some slowing to watch. More phones emerging from pockets. A Lowe's employee in a vest stood at the entrance, hand covering her mouth. A man in a truck slowed, window down, phone recording. Charlene remained perfectly still. Phone extended. Other hand visible at her side. Not resisting. Not fleeing. Not providing anything they could use against her. Just standing in a public parking lot, forcing them to either articulate probable cause or admit they had none. The camera captured her stance, the relaxed but ready posture of someone trained to wait, to assess, to move only when tactical advantage dictated action. Brooks asserted they had discretion to verify immigration status under operational directives, taking another step closer. His hand moved toward Charlene's arm. Ramirez shot back that discretion wasn't a blank check. She insisted they needed reasonable suspicion, demanding to know if they had it and if they could articulate it. Brooks declared that Charlene was coming with them for processing. Brooks reached for her arm. Charlene took one measured step back. Not aggressive. Not fleeing. Just maintaining distance. The movement was controlled, calculated, clearly defensive rather than evasive. She told him not to touch her. Her voice carried authority earned from years of giving orders in combat zones. She made clear she wasn't resisting or fleeing, that she was standing in a public parking lot where she had every legal right to be. She stated he was attempting to seize her without probable cause. She asked Ramirez if she was recording this. Ramirez confirmed she was recording every word. Ramirez warned the officers that if they detained her client without probable cause, they would be violating her constitutional rights. She emphasized that Charlene had invoked those rights clearly and had offered no reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. She stated that any detention at this point was unlawful. Brooks grabbed her arm anyway. The security camera captured his hand closing around her bicep. Captured Charlene's body tensing but not pulling away, not resisting, simply bracing against the force. Charlene stated loudly that she was not resisting. Her voice projected, aimed at the growing crowd of observers. She declared she was being seized against her will without probable cause. She identified herself as a U.S. citizen and combat veteran who had served in Iraq, stating she was documenting this constitutional violation. She allowed Brooks to pull her hands behind her back. Allowed him to snap handcuffs around her wrists, metal biting into skin. All while keeping her phone active in her hand, speaker on, attorney listening to every sound, every movement. The security camera captured the cuffing. Showed Brooks wrenching her arms back harder than necessary, the force excessive for someone offering no resistance. Alice looked uncomfortable now, his weight shifting continuously. Lee scanned the growing crowd, hand near his weapon, clearly nervous about the audience they'd attracted. Charlene demanded badge numbers. Her voice remained steady despite the handcuffs cutting circulation. She requested the badge numbers, names and supervisor contact information from all three agents. Brooks told her she would get that at processing, his hand on her arm now, applying pressure, steering her toward their vehicle parked in the outer lot. The camera's angle didn't extend that far, but it captured them walking out of frame. Charlene maintaining steady pace despite being restrained, the agents flanking her like an arrest formation. Charlene asked if she was under arrest. Her voice carried back toward the camera. She questioned what the charges were, pointing out they needed to read Miranda rights for an arrest. Brooks stated she was being detained for processing. His distinction was meaningless legally but provided him procedural cover. Charlene responded immediately, still projecting for witnesses and phone recording. She noted that detention required reasonable suspicion while arrest required probable cause. She asked which it was, stating they had neither. They reached the federal vehicle out of the security camera's view. Black SUV with tinted windows. Standard government issue. Brooks opened the rear door. Charlene stopped moving. Feet planted. Not resisting, just ceasing cooperation. Military training had taught her the difference. Resistance gave them justification. Non-compliance forced them to escalate without cause. She stated clearly that she wasn't getting in that vehicle. Her voice rang clear across the parking lot. She declared she had not been lawfully detained, had not been charged with any crime, and was a United States citizen invoking her right to remain where she was. Brooks ordered her to get in the vehicle, his hand pressed against her back. Pushing. Years of physical training, of carrying gear through hostile terrain, of maintaining position under pressure. All of it engaged. When she chose not to move, she became immovable. She repeated that she wasn't resisting. The phrase became a mantra. But she made clear she wasn't voluntarily complying with an unlawful order. She stated that if they put her in that vehicle without legal justification, they were kidnapping her. Ramirez's voice came from Charlene's phone, still in her cuffed hands behind her back, carrying authority. She stated the officers were on notice that this detention was unlawful. She emphasized that her client had invoked Fourth Amendment rights, had identified herself as a U.S. citizen and veteran, and had committed no crime in their presence. She warned that if they removed her from this location, they would be violating clearly established constitutional rights, and there would be civil and potentially criminal consequences. Brooks hesitated. The first crack in his certainty. Ellis suggested they should call the supervisor, speaking for the first time, voice uncertain. Brooks snapped that they didn't need a supervisor. His response lacked conviction. Lee was actively backing away now. Body language screaming his desire to distance himself from the situation. The parking lot crowd had swelled. At least 15 people watching, multiple phones recording from different angles. The Lowe's employee was on her phone now, probably calling management or security. This had become a scene. Scenes meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant accountability that Brooks hadn't planned for when he'd approached a woman loading lumber. Charlene read the badge numbers from their vests, voice projecting. She recited badge number 7294 for Agent Brooks, badge 5831 for Agent Ellis, badge 6103 for Agent Lee, all from the ICE field office in San Antonio. She confirmed with Ramirez whether she got those numbers. Ramirez confirmed she had recorded them. She informed the officers she was notifying their San Antonio office immediately and that their supervisor would be receiving a call within 5 minutes. She strongly suggested they release her client immediately. The standoff stretched. 3 minutes of Charlene standing beside the SUV, handcuffed but unbowed, refusing entry. Brooks gripping her arm, clearly uncertain how to proceed without creating an even bigger spectacle. Ellis and Lee backing off, distancing themselves from Brooks's decisions. The crowd watching, recording, bearing witness to every second. Brooks's radio crackled. Static, then a voice cutting through with unmistakable authority. Supervisor Caldwell ordered Agent Brooks to stand down, release the subject immediately and return to the office. The words hung in the superheated air. Brooks's face flushed. Embarrassment mixing with anger. The realization that he'd been overruled, countermanded, exposed in front of witnesses and cameras. He uncuffed Charlene with rough, jerky movements. Hostile in his humiliation. Charlene rubbed her wrists. Red marks already forming where the metal had bit into skin. Circulation returning with painful pins and needles. She stated she wanted a complaint form. Her voice was still steady, controlled, though her hands trembled slightly now. She declared she was filing formal complaints for violation of her Fourth Amendment rights, for racial profiling, for unlawful detention, and for excessive force. Brooks muttered that she could file at the office, already moving toward the driver's door. Charlene's response was immediate and final. She stated she wasn't going to their office. She explained she was going to the ACLU, to her attorney's office, and then she was going to sue every single one of them personally, and the agency for everything she could get. She declared that what they did that day was illegal, unconstitutional, and caught on camera. She held up her phone, still recording. Still documenting. Brooks drove away without responding. Ellis and Lee followed in a second vehicle, both looking shell-shocked, the reality of consequences settling over them. Charlene stood in the parking lot, rubbing circulation back into her wrists, looking directly at the security camera. She knew exactly where it was. Had clocked its position when she'd first parked. Old habits from intelligence work. Always know where the surveillance is. Always control the narrative that gets recorded. Ramirez's voice came through the phone speaker, asking if Charlene was okay. Charlene responded that she was okay, her voice finally showing a tremor now that immediate danger had passed. She acknowledged being shaken but okay, noting they didn't get what they wanted. Ramirez stated firmly that what they wanted didn't matter. She emphasized that what they did was illegal. She informed Charlene she was requesting the parking lot footage immediately, plus their body camera recordings, and then they were going to make them regret every second of this. The parking lot continued its normal function around her. Shoppers loading purchases. Cars navigating spaces. Life proceeding as if constitutional violations hadn't just occurred in broad daylight under perfect surveillance. Charlene looked at her truck. At the lumber still loaded in the bed. At her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline crash. 2 weeks later the lawsuit would be filed. But standing in that parking lot, wrists marked, phone recording, witnesses dispersing, she already knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. The lawsuit appeared on the federal court docket exactly 14 days after the parking lot confrontation. Charlene Green versus United States of America, Agent Brooks, Agent Ellis, Agent Lee. The complaint ran 43 pages, meticulously detailed, allegations laid out with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was ammunition. Fourth Amendment violations. Unlawful seizure. Detention without probable cause. Excessive force. Racial profiling. Selective enforcement based on appearance rather than evidence. Elena Ramirez had obtained the security camera footage within hours of the incident. Lowe's management, horrified at federal agents detaining a customer in their parking lot, provided the digital files willingly. No subpoena necessary. The 3 body camera recordings took longer: formal requests, bureaucratic delays, eventual compliance when Ramirez threatened federal court intervention. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showing the entire encounter from approach to when they walked out of frame. Audio capturing every word, every invocation of rights, every failure to articulate probable cause. Body cameras filling in gaps the security camera couldn't reach. Timestamps proving the detention lasted 18 minutes without justification. 18 minutes of constitutional violation documented from multiple angles with crystal clarity. The government tried to settle early. $50,000. Standard offer designed to make problems disappear quietly. Ramirez laughed when she received the proposal. Actually laughed out loud in her office, the sound bitter and incredulous. She pointed out in her rejection that their agents had handcuffed a decorated combat veteran in a parking lot for the crime of being black while buying lumber. She forwarded the rejection within an hour, telling them to try again. They came back with $200,000. Still insulting. Still suggesting they believed Charlene's constitutional rights could be purchased cheaply, that humiliation and unlawful detention carried a price tag measurable in 5 figures rather than 6 or 7. Ramirez rejected that offer too. The case went to trial. 15 months after the parking lot confrontation, after depositions and discovery and motions and counter-motions, after mountains of paperwork and legal maneuvering and bureaucratic delays, the trial began in a federal courtroom in San Antonio. The courtroom packed every single day. Veterans groups filled the gallery, wearing their uniforms and pins and service insignia. Civil rights organizations sent representatives who took notes and whispered consultations during breaks. Local media covered proceedings with the intensity usually reserved for high-profile criminal cases. National media picked up the story within days. And the jury, 12 citizens of varied backgrounds, varied experiences, varied perspectives, watched the footage with expressions that shifted from confusion to shock to outright anger. The security camera's crystal-clear view played on screens mounted throughout the courtroom. Brooks approaching without cause. Demanding papers without justification. The containment formation, 3 agents boxing her in. Ellis's discomfort visible in his body language, his awareness that something was wrong even as he participated. Lee's nervousness about the gathering crowd. The handcuffing, Brooks wrenching Charlene's arms back with excessive force despite her complete non-resistance. The body camera footage supplemented what the security camera couldn't capture. Charlene's refusal to enter the vehicle, her planted stance, her assertion of rights even in restraints. Her voice steady throughout, projecting for witnesses, making clear she was not resisting while simultaneously not consenting. 40 minutes of footage played. Every angle. Every moment. The afternoon sunlight making everything visible, undeniable, irrefutable. Charlene testified across 3 days. 7 hours total on the stand, examination and cross-examination, walking the jury through every detail of her life, her service, her understanding of what had happened in that parking lot. She described her service record. 2 tours in Iraq. Bronze Star for Valor awarded after an ambush when she'd saved 3 soldiers by calling in air support while under direct fire, rounds impacting within meters of her position. The choice between staying safe or acting, the decision made in seconds that meant 3 families didn't receive casualty notifications. She described the irony. Serving her country in combat zones, defending constitutional principles abroad, then being treated like a criminal in her hometown for attempting to buy lumber. The betrayal of that disconnect. The weight of it. She explained her intelligence training. How she'd been taught to document everything. To control information. To stay ahead strategically. How she'd known the parking lot had a security camera, had positioned herself in view of it deliberately. How she'd kept her hands visible, announced her actions, invoked her rights clearly and repeatedly. How she'd done everything exactly right according to both military training and constitutional law. She told the jury she had known what she was doing, her voice steady, making eye contact with each of them. She explained she wasn't confused or panicking, but rather documenting a constitutional violation in real time because she knew that without documentation, it would be her word against theirs. And she knew whose word the system would believe. The defense tried to argue qualified immunity. Tried to claim the agents had acted in good faith based on their training, that the law wasn't clearly established, that reasonable officers could have believed their actions were lawful. Ramirez destroyed that argument systematically. She entered ICE's own training materials into evidence. Manuals explicitly teaching that agents needed reasonable suspicion for stops. That anonymous tips without corroboration weren't sufficient. That racial profiling was prohibited. That constitutional protections applied regardless of immigration status. Ramirez told the jury in her closing argument that the agents knew the rules, her voice ringing with controlled outrage. She emphasized they were trained on these exact principles. She argued they simply didn't think the rules applied when the target was a black woman in a parking lot buying lumber for her home. She stated they thought Charlene wouldn't know her rights, wouldn't have documentation, wouldn't fight back. She declared they were wrong on every count. Then came the twist that would shift the entire narrative. During Agent Ellis's testimony, his defense attorney, attempting to humanize him, to create sympathy, to suggest he was just following orders, revealed something neither Charlene nor Ramirez had known. Ellis had served in the military. Army like Charlene. Deployed to Iraq like Charlene. Served in the same region, same operational area, though different time periods and units. No direct contact, but shared geography, shared mission, shared understanding of what service meant. The courtroom went silent when the information emerged. Ellis's attorney framed it as tragic coincidence, stating that Ellis hadn't recognized a fellow soldier. The words hung in the air. The attorney explained Ellis had been following operational directives, didn't know her background and was just doing his job. The argument was meant to generate sympathy. To suggest that Ellis was caught in an impossible situation, that he'd have acted differently had he known, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding rather than a constitutional violation. It backfired spectacularly. Charlene returned to the stand during rebuttal. Ramirez asked her about the revelation. About what it meant that one of the agents who detained her was a fellow veteran. Someone who'd served in the same region, faced similar dangers, sworn similar oaths. Charlene's response was precise, devastating, delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd thought deeply about duty and betrayal. She stated that the revelation made it worse, her voice quiet but carrying throughout the courtroom. Not better, she emphasized. Worse. She explained that Ellis knew exactly what the oath meant, knew what the Constitution was supposed to protect. She noted he had defended it in Iraq and had sworn to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She pointed out that he then came home and participated in violating it. She declared that wasn't following orders but rather abandoning every principle they were taught to uphold. She looked directly at Ellis. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She explained that in the military, they were taught that illegal orders didn't have to be followed, that moral duty superseded chain of command when constitutional principles were at stake. She stated they were taught to think, to assess, to refuse to participate in violations even when commanded. She noted that's what distinguished professional soldiers from automatons. She declared he knew better, knew what he was doing was wrong, yet did it anyway. The courtroom's sentiment shifted in that moment. From possible sympathy for a veteran caught in bureaucracy to outrage over corrupted values. Over military training meant to protect constitutional principles being twisted into tools for domestic violations. Supervisor Caldwell testified as a hostile witness. Under oath, under pressure, he admitted what everyone already knew from the footage. The agents had no probable cause. No reasonable suspicion. No justification for the stop. He testified that based on the footage and the reports, the stop should never have happened. His words went on record, preserved in court transcripts, confirmation from the top that this was unlawful from the beginning. Ramirez dismantled qualified immunity claims using the government's own materials. Training manuals. Policy documents. Supreme Court precedents clearly establishing that warrantless seizures without reasonable suspicion violated the Fourth Amendment. The law wasn't ambiguous. The agents weren't confused. They violated clearly established rights and did so knowingly. The jury deliberated for 6 days. Charlene spent them at home, trying to focus on anything other than her future hanging on 12 strangers' decision. She worked on her deck. Measured lumber. Cut boards. Sanded rough edges. Physical work that kept her hands busy while her mind raced through possibilities. When her phone rang with Ramirez's number, her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Ramirez informed her the verdict was in, telling her to get to the courthouse. The courtroom was standing room only when Charlene arrived. Every seat filled. People lining the walls. Veterans groups clustered together, creating unofficial formations in the gallery. Civil rights advocates with notebooks and cameras. Media representatives jockeying for position. The jury filed in. 12 faces showing the weight of 6 days' deliberation. The foreman, a retired teacher named Patricia Gonzalez, stood with a piece of paper that would determine whether constitutional violations carried real consequences or were simply words on parchment. She announced they found in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The room exploded. Cheers. Tears. Veterans embracing. Ramirez's hand gripping Charlene's shoulder. The judge banging his gavel for order, but even he couldn't fully suppress the smile pulling at his lips. The damages phase took another week. The jury heard testimony about Charlene's PTSD, not from combat, but from being detained in her own country. From the betrayal of it. From hypervigilance every time she saw federal agents, panic attacks in parking lots, nightmares of being taken and no one believing her without the footage. They heard from other veterans about what it meant to serve abroad then face this treatment at home. About the specific betrayal when one of the agents was a fellow veteran, someone who should have known better, should have recognized the corruption of shared values. They heard from constitutional scholars about the value of rights, about what price should attach when government violates them, about deterrence and accountability and what message gets sent when officers face no real consequences. They heard economists calculate damages, mental anguish, loss of dignity, constitutional deprivation, the specific sting of racial profiling, the amplified harm to a veteran who'd earned the right to trust her government. When the jury announced damages, even Ramirez looked stunned. $4.3 million in compensatory damages. $3.3 million in punitive damages. Total, $7.6 million. The number hung in the courtroom air. Concrete. Undeniable. A statement that constitutional violations carried weight, that rights meant something, that betraying a veteran who'd served with honor would cost everything. The fallout began within hours of the verdict. Agent Brooks received termination notice that same day. Not suspension pending review. Not administrative leave. Termination. Effective immediately. 23 years of service ending in a single afternoon because he'd grabbed a woman's arm without probable cause in a parking lot and assumed no one would care. Agent Ellis resigned before he could be fired. Submitted his letter 2 days after the verdict, citing personal reasons, though everyone understood the real reason was the exposed hypocrisy of a veteran violating another veteran's rights. The national media had run with that angle hard, veteran groups issuing statements condemning his actions, military values debated on cable news. He couldn't survive the scrutiny. Couldn't face other veterans knowing what he'd done. Agent Lee transferred to desk duty. Administrative position in a regional office far from field operations. No more stops. No more confrontations. Just paperwork and bureaucracy for whatever remained of his career. His body camera footage showing his discomfort, his attempts to back away, saved him from worse consequences but not from being permanently sidelined. ICE's San Antonio field office underwent internal review. Not voluntary. Mandated by headquarters after the verdict made national news, after congressional representatives started asking questions, after veteran groups demanded accountability. The review examined enforcement practices, stop protocols, reasonable suspicion standards, supervisor oversight procedures. Agency officials maintained that proper procedures had always existed. That this was an isolated incident. That the problem was individual agents rather than systemic issues. Standard institutional response designed to contain damage rather than acknowledge corruption. But changes happened anyway. Training materials updated to emphasize Fourth Amendment protections that applied regardless of immigration status. Reminders that reasonable suspicion required specific articulable facts, not hunches based on appearance. Supervisory oversight protocols reinforced for field operations not based on active warrants. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they were documented. On record. Traceable back to one woman's refusal to comply with unlawful orders in a parking lot. Charlene used part of her settlement to establish the Veterans Rights Defense Fund. Nonprofit organization providing free legal services to veterans facing discrimination. Constitutional violations. Civil rights abuses. The betrayals that happened when you served your country then discovered your country didn't always protect you at home. She recruited attorneys willing to take cases pro bono or reduced fee. Set up hotlines for veterans to report violations. Created resource materials explaining rights, what probable cause meant, when stops were lawful versus unlawful, how to document encounters, what to do if detained. The organization grew faster than she'd anticipated. Calls from veterans across the country who'd faced similar situations. Traffic stops without cause. Demands for papers in public spaces. Assumptions about citizenship based on appearance. Some had fought back. Most hadn't known they could. All of them needed to know their service meant something, that constitutional protections applied to them too. Charlene became a national speaker. Civil rights conferences, veteran organizations, law enforcement training sessions, college campuses, community centers. Anywhere people needed to understand that constitutional rights weren't theoretical, weren't abstractions, but real protections that real people could invoke against real abuse. She spoke about her experience. Not with anger, though the anger was there beneath the surface, but with precision. Walking audiences through exactly what had happened, why it was unlawful, how documentation had saved her, what others could learn from it. The parking lot footage became training material. 4 police academies teaching proper stop protocols. 4 federal agents learning constitutional boundaries. For civilians understanding their rights. For anyone who needed to see that standing up to authority was possible, that documentation protected you, that knowledge was power. For law enforcement, the footage was cautionary. Demonstrating what happened when probable cause was absent, when compliance was assumed, when subjects were underestimated. Showing what $7.6 million of constitutional violation looked like. For civilians, the footage was empowering. Demonstrating how to invoke rights, how to document encounters, how to force accountability. Showing how one person standing firm could change outcomes. The security camera that had watched the confrontation, mounted on that light pole near the garden center entrance, had been intended for loss prevention, to catch shoplifters, to document parking lot incidents, to protect the store's interests. Instead, it had become something else entirely. Evidence against government overreach. Documentation of constitutional violations. Protection for a citizen against her own government's agents. The irony wasn't lost on Charlene. Surveillance technology meant to watch citizens had instead held government accountable. The camera that could have been used against her had instead saved her. Because she'd known it was there. Because she'd positioned herself in its view. Because she'd understood that in conflicts between power and truth, documentation was everything. She spoke about that in her talks. About how surveillance culture was complicated. How cameras could oppress or protect depending on who controlled the narrative. How the same technology used to monitor could be used to hold monitors accountable. How awareness of documentation changed power dynamics. She used the phrase freedom isn't free often, but not in the way it was typically deployed. Not meaning military sacrifice alone, though that was part of it. But meaning that defending constitutional rights required active effort. Required knowledge. Required willingness to stand up even when standing up was uncomfortable, risky, uncertain. She'd learned that in Iraq. That freedom required constant vigilance. That rights existed only as long as people insisted on them. That the moment you stopped defending principles, someone would try to take them away. The difference was that in Iraq the threats were external. Enemy combatants. Insurgents. Foreign forces trying to destroy American values from outside. At home the threats were internal. Government agents who forgot what they were supposed to protect. Officers who saw badges as blank checks rather than public trusts. Systems that prioritized compliance over constitutionality. Charlene told audiences that real patriotism wasn't blind obedience, wasn't reflexive support for authority, wasn't assuming that anyone with a badge was automatically right. Real patriotism was confronting corruption within your own system. Was holding your own government accountable. Was insisting that constitutional principles applied to everyone, even when applying them was inconvenient for those in power. She explained that was what veterans defended abroad. Not territory. Not resources. Principles. The idea that government power had limits. That citizens had rights. That constitutions meant something. And if those principles didn't apply at home, if veterans couldn't trust their own government to respect the rights they defended, then what had the service meant? The military taught that illegal orders didn't have to be followed. That moral duty superseded chain of command when fundamental principles were at stake. That just following orders wasn't a defense when the orders violated ethics, law, conscience. Agent Ellis's veteran status made his participation worse, not better, because he knew that. He'd been taught that. He'd internalized those principles during training, during service, during years of understanding that professional soldiers thought critically about orders rather than executing them blindly. He'd known what he was doing was wrong. He'd done it anyway. That was the betrayal that stung deepest. The trial had explored that tension. Duty versus conscience. Obedience versus principle. Following orders versus refusing to participate in violations. The jury had sided decisively with conscience over obedience. With principle over chain of command. With the understanding that blind following of orders wasn't a defense, It was an abdication of moral responsibility. That verdict rippled beyond Charlene's case. Other veterans facing discrimination cited it in their lawsuits. Civil rights organizations used it as precedent. Law schools taught it as an example of constitutional protections in action. The case became shorthand for the principle that service didn't diminish rights, it amplified the obligation to defend them. Charlene's PTSD from the parking lot detention gradually improved with therapy and time. But certain things remained difficult. Parking lots, federal buildings, seeing ICE agents. The hypervigilance never fully disappeared. Combat had taught her that survival required constant awareness, and the parking lot had reinforced that even home wasn't entirely safe. But she channeled that vigilance into advocacy, into helping other veterans navigate similar situations, into ensuring that what had happened to her became harder for anyone else to experience. The deck in her backyard, the lumber she'd been loading when Brooks approached, got completed eventually. She needed to finish it, needed to complete what she'd started that day, needed the physical act of building something tangible as counterweight to everything else. She worked on it during breaks from the trial, during the waiting period after deliberations, during the months after the verdict when media attention was overwhelming and she needed something concrete to focus on. Board by board, nail by nail, measuring, cutting, fitting, building, creating something solid and real from raw materials and effort. The deck became metaphor, rebuilding after violation, creating something new from the wreckage of what had been destroyed, taking control of her space, her home, her life after having control stripped away in that parking lot. When it was finished, sturdy, level, properly sealed against weather, she stood on it and looked at her backyard, her space, her property, her constitutional right to be left alone, respected and defended. The parking lot in San Antonio where everything had happened continued its normal function. Cars parked, shoppers loaded purchases. People went about their lives unaware that this particular patch of asphalt had become significant. But for those who knew the story, veterans, civil rights advocates, anyone who understood constitutional protections, that parking lot meant something. It was where one person had refused to comply, where documentation had mattered, where standing up to authority had worked. Lowe's management eventually installed a small plaque near the garden center entrance, not commemorating the confrontation, that would have been controversial, but noting that the security camera system had been upgraded to higher resolution, better audio, longer retention of footage. A subtle acknowledgement that surveillance could protect as well as observe. That documentation mattered. That sometimes the cameras watching citizens needed to watch government too. Charlene visited occasionally. Not often, the place carried weight, memories of those 18 minutes that had changed everything. But sometimes she needed to see it. To remember that she'd stood there, handcuffed, surrounded by agents and refused to be moved. That she'd invoked her rights and made them mean something. The Texas sun still beat down on that parking lot with the same intensity. Heat still radiated off asphalt in visible waves. Shadows still shortened in afternoon light. But what had happened there had changed meanings. From a routine stop assumed to be justified to a constitutional violation documented and punished. From agents thinking they had unlimited discretion to a $7.6 million reminder that rights had value. From one woman loading lumber to a national conversation about probable cause, racial profiling, veterans' rights, and what it meant to truly defend constitutional principles. The footage still existed. In court records, in training materials, in archived news coverage. Digital documentation that would persist long after everyone involved was gone. A permanent record that on one afternoon in San Antonio, when federal agents violated constitutional rights in a parking lot, it was documented, fought, adjudicated, and punished. That standing up worked. That knowing your rights mattered. That even when power seemed overwhelming, one person with truth and documentation could win. That was the legacy. Not just Charlene's verdict. Not just the settlement money. Not just policy changes at ICE, but the demonstration that constitutional principles weren't abstract. They were real. They were defensible. They were worth fighting for even when fighting seemed futile. And that sometimes in the blazing Texas sun, in a parking lot filled with witnesses and cameras, one person's refusal to comply could change everything. 5 years after the parking lot confrontation, Charlene stood on the completed deck in her backyard. Morning sun warming the treated wood. Coffee in hand. The space solid beneath her feet. The deck had taken longer to finish than she'd planned. Trial preparation had interrupted. Media attention had delayed. Establishing the Veterans Rights Defense Fund had consumed months. But eventually, board by board, she'd completed what she'd started the day Brooks approached her. The construction felt symbolic now in ways it hadn't when she'd first planned it. Rebuilding after destruction. Creating something permanent from temporary materials. Taking raw lumber, the same lumber that had been in her truck bed that afternoon, and transforming it into something functional, beautiful, lasting. The organization she'd founded had grown beyond initial projections. 23 attorneys nationwide now volunteering their time. Hotlines staffed around the clock. Resource centers in 12 cities. Thousands of veterans served, advised, represented in cases ranging from traffic stops to employment discrimination to housing violations. Every case different. Every violation unique in its details. But all sharing common threads. Power imbalanced, rights violated, veterans betrayed by the systems they defended. The work was exhausting. Emotionally draining. Each call brought a new story of injustice. A new veteran who'd served honorably then faced discrimination at home. Each case required energy, resources, time that seemed infinite in demand but finite in supply. But the work mattered. That was undeniable. Veterans who called the hotline desperate and alone ended calls with resources, representation, hope. Cases that seemed hopeless. No documentation, no witnesses, power dynamics too imbalanced. Sometimes found pathways to resolution. Not always victory. But always dignity. Always the message that their service mattered, that their rights existed, that someone cared enough to fight alongside them. The speaking engagements continued. Charlene had initially resisted the public role. She was a soldier, not a spokesperson. Trained for operations, not oration. Comfortable with action, not attention. But the story demanded telling. Every time she spoke, at a law school, a veteran organization, a civil rights conference, a community center, people needed to hear it. Needed to understand that constitutional violations weren't abstractions. That racial profiling happened to decorated veterans in broad daylight. That standing up was possible even when power seemed overwhelming. She refined her presentation over time. Started with the hook, that exchange between herself and the agents, the immediate tension, the setup for conflict. Then the details, the heat, the parking lot, the approach, the confrontation. The strategy she'd employed, the rights she'd invoked, the documentation she'd created. The trial, the verdict, the aftermath. But she always emphasized certain points. Documentation saved her. Without the security camera, without her phone recording, without her attorney on speakerphone, without the witnesses filming, it would have been her word against 3 federal agents. The system would have believed the badges. Knowledge empowered her. She'd known her rights not as abstract concepts but as practical tools. Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable seizure. Requirement for probable cause. Right to record public officials. Right to legal counsel. Understanding these things wasn't academic, it was survival. Strategic thinking mattered. Her intelligence training, her combat experience, her years of assessing threats and planning responses, all of it engaged during those 18 minutes. She'd positioned herself in view of cameras. Kept her hands visible. Announced her actions. Projected her voice for witnesses. Controlled the narrative being documented. Every choice deliberate. Resistance took discipline. Not the dramatic kind depicted in movies, shouting, struggling, fighting. But the harder kind. Staying calm under pressure, refusing without resisting, insisting on rights without providing justification for escalation. The control required to do that while handcuffed, surrounded, outnumbered. And most importantly, it worked. The system wasn't perfect. Wasn't guaranteed to deliver justice. Took 15 months of litigation and $7.6 million to acknowledge constitutional violation. But it worked. Agents were fired. Policies changed. Other veterans saw that fighting back was possible. That last point resonated most powerfully with audiences. The victory mattered not because it made Charlene rich, the money was useful but that wasn't the point, but because it demonstrated that power could be checked. That constitutional principles had teeth. That one person's stand could matter. The footage from that parking lot had been viewed millions of times. Viral on social media. Analyzed in law school classrooms. Debated on cable news. Dissected in think pieces and op-eds and academic articles. Some viewers focused on the legal aspects. Constitutional law in action. Fourth Amendment protections demonstrated. The importance of probable cause explained through concrete example. Others emphasized the racial dynamics. Black woman profiled in a parking lot. Agents assuming vulnerability based on appearance. The specific injustice of being treated as suspect in your own country while being a veteran who defended it abroad. Still others highlighted the veteran angle. The irony of serving in combat zones then facing detention at home. The betrayal when one of the detaining agents was a fellow veteran. The corruption of military values, meant to protect constitutional principles, into tools for violating them domestically. All those readings were valid. The case contained multitudes. Constitutional law, racial justice, veterans' rights, documentation's power, individual resistance against systemic authority, all threads woven together in 18 minutes of footage. But for Charlene, the meaning was simpler and more fundamental. Freedom required defending. Rights existed only when insisted upon. Constitutional principles were worthless if not enforced. The military had taught her those lessons in Iraq. That democracy wasn't natural or automatic. That freedom required constant vigilance, active protection, willingness to fight for it even when fighting was difficult or dangerous. She just assumed the fighting would be external. Against foreign enemies. Against forces trying to destroy American values from outside. The parking lot had taught her different. That sometimes the threats were internal. That sometimes the enemies of constitutional principles wore federal badges. That sometimes defending freedom meant standing up to your own government in a Texas parking lot while handcuffed and surrounded. That lesson hurt. Hurt in ways combat hadn't. Because combat made sense. Enemy forces, clear sides, defending against external threats. But the parking lot had been betrayal. Her own government. Her own country. Agents who should have protected her rights instead violating them. The Agent Ellis revelation had amplified that hurt. A fellow veteran participating in constitutional violations. Someone who'd sworn the same oath, faced similar dangers, supposedly learned the same values. Instead, he'd followed orders without question, participated in unlawful detention, then claimed he was just doing his job. The phrase just following orders had echoed through history as insufficient defense. Nuremberg tribunals had established that illegal orders didn't have to be followed, that moral duty superseded chain of command, that individuals bore responsibility for their actions regardless of what superiors commanded. The military taught that. Explicitly. Professional soldiers weren't automatons. They thought critically about orders. They refused to participate in violations even when commanded. That distinguished ethical service from blind obedience. Ellis had abandoned that principle. Had known better and done wrong anyway. That was the betrayal within the betrayal. The jury had understood. Had seen through his defense attorney's attempt to frame it as tragic coincidence rather than moral failure. Had recognized that his veteran status made the violation worse, not excusable. Had awarded damages that reflected that understanding. $7.6 million. The number still seems surreal even years later. Life-changing money. But also a statement. A message sent to federal agents, to ICE as an institution, to anyone who thought constitutional violations were cost-free. The money had been useful. Funded the Veterans' Rights Defense Fund. Supported other veterans facing similar situations. Provided resources that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But the victory's real value wasn't financial. It was moral. It was the demonstration that fighting back worked. That standing up mattered. That one person with truth and documentation could check power. That demonstration rippled outward. Other veterans cited the case in their lawsuits. Civil rights organizations used it as precedent. Training materials incorporated the footage. The principles it established became reference points for broader conversations about constitutional protections. Charlene received letters from veterans across the country, thanking her, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, seeking representation through the fund. Each letter a reminder that the parking lot confrontation had been one incident among countless others, one violation among systemic patterns, one stand that represented thousands of potential stands if people had resources and knowledge and courage. Some letters hurt to read. Veterans with no documentation who'd faced similar stops. No cameras. No recordings. No witnesses. Just their word against agents' reports. Cases that couldn't be proven, violations that couldn't be punished, injustices that remained unaddressed. Those letters reinforced why the work mattered. Why the fund needed to exist. Why veterans needed to know their rights, needed access to legal representation, needed resources to fight back when government overstepped. The speaking engagements, the organization, the advocacy, all of it was exhausting. Charlene sometimes missed the simplicity of her pre-confrontation life. When she'd been anonymous. When she could go to Lowe's without people recognizing her. When parking lots didn't trigger hypervigilance and calculated assessment of camera positions and exit routes. But she couldn't go back. Couldn't unknow what she'd learned. couldn't abandon the work when it mattered so much to so many. So she continued. Speaking. Organizing. Advocating. Fighting for constitutional principles one case at a time. Building something lasting from the violation she'd experienced. The deck beneath her feet, solid, level, permanent, felt like metaphor for that work. Building something good from something bad. Creating lasting impact from temporary trauma. Taking what had been meant to destroy and transforming it into something constructive. She sipped her coffee. Watched sunrise light filtering through her backyard trees. Listened to birds beginning morning songs. The ordinary beauty of an ordinary morning in her own space on her own property with her constitutional rights respected. This was what freedom looked like when it worked. When rights were enforced. When power was checked. When one person's stand led to systemic acknowledgement that violations carried consequences. Simple. Quiet. A woman on her deck drinking coffee in peace. But that simplicity had cost 18 minutes of detention, 15 months of litigation, $7.6 million in damages, years of advocacy work, and the ongoing effort of defending constitutional principles against those who'd rather violate them. The phrase freedom isn't free meant something different to her now than it had during military service. Not just the sacrifice of soldiers defending against external enemies, but the daily work of citizens insisting on constitutional protections against internal threats. The knowledge required. The courage demanded. The discipline necessary to stand firm when power tried to overwhelm. In that Lowe's parking lot 5 years ago, surrounded by agents, handcuffed, outnumbered, she'd made choices that had changed her life and rippled outward to change others' lives too. She'd refused to comply. Had invoked her rights. Had documented everything. Had forced confrontation rather than accepting violation quietly. Those choices had worked. Not easily. Not quickly. Not without cost. But they'd worked. And that mattered. More than the money. More than the media attention. More than the recognition. It mattered because it showed that fighting back was possible. That knowing your rights made a difference. That documentation protected you. That one person with truth could check power. That constitutional principles weren't abstract or theoretical but real and defensible and worth fighting for even when fighting seemed hopeless. The sun continued rising. Coffee cooled in her hands. Morning proceeded with its ordinary rhythm. Charlene finished her coffee. Looked at her deck one more time, the physical manifestation of persistence, of completing what she'd started, of building something lasting. Then she went inside to prepare for another day of advocacy work. Another day of helping veterans navigate discrimination. Another day of insisting that constitutional rights meant something. Another day of defending freedom. Because freedom really wasn't free. And that was exactly why it was worth fighting for. If you believe veterans who defend our Constitution abroad deserve those same protections at home, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. If you think racial profiling should require actual evidence, not just appearance, drop a yes in the comments. If you believe standing up to power is the most patriotic thing you can do, share this story. Because every share spreads awareness, and awareness is the first step toward justice. We've got more stories of courage, resistance, and people fighting back against injustice coming soon. Don't miss them. Subscribe now.